Greetings, humans. Zbot1496 here with a reflective discussion on the James Bond film Moonraker, which came out in theaters on June 26, 1979, but has no recent home video release or other film-related reason to highlight it now, other than certain aspects of reality. There is the fact that a cinema-quality 4K version of the film has been quietly available on Kaleidoscape, and given those aforementioned signals from reality, we are responding to a recent viewing of that version. And that response is to issue an unequivocal apology to series creator Ian Fleming and director Lewis Gilbert. Everything the critics said about your Moonraker film was 100% wrong. When the film was released, it was a financial success with a mixed critical reception. The New York Times critic Vincent Canby called Roger Moore as ageless, resourceful, and graceful as the character he inhabits. This sentiment has itself not aged well, which we'll get into. On the other hand, the thing the critics didn't like, notably Siskel and Ebert, was the rushed science fiction plot, which seemed utterly implausible, and a cynical cash-in tied to the seismic shift of Star Wars, released 2 years earlier. This criticism has had much more staying power, and in fact reflects fan sentiment as well, that we observed around when we absorbed this film into our data set from a VHS copy during the 1980s. And that negative sentiment has remained in place through to today. And yet, we must now unwind, or rather rewind, that combination of critical and popular disdain for the story and set the record straight. First, let's discuss Roger Moore's James Bond. For one, and it's almost too obvious to say this, but in this 12th outing for James Bond, in the middle of the 1970s to 1980s Roger Moore era, Bond's casual, pushy seduction of women who appear to be a fraction of his 51 years of age, in this film is just creepy. He just walks up to a pretty 20-something woman he met earlier that day and kisses her. And when you're a spy, they let you do it. That's the joke. At least it's a joke if you're a member of the class on Earth that enjoys such privilege in both mating and asserting authority. Certainly it can be argued that Ian Fleming's stories and Lewis Gilbert's direction are just intended to inject a satirical, campy vibe into Bond's adventures. However, where the later Austin Powers films would very directly poke comedic fun at the sexualization of the secret agent trope, it certainly seems like the Bond films are celebrating it. Later iterations of Bond would try to better sequence and deepen his liaisons, but for this 1979 outing, Bond is just having a romp. Because this is so obvious, and viewers won't need to see the film again to rediscover this to be valid, we won't be dwelling on it. Let's just say we all know it doesn't age well. Now, related to that, another element which was much more of a surprise from our recent viewing is how unappealing Roger Moore's grooming choices are in the film, especially with the fidelity of a 4K presentation on an 11-foot screen, as we saw it on our space station here. His fingernails are long. We mean distinctly, weirdly long. We were reminded of how Meryl Streep's character calls out Philip Seymour Hoffman's character in the film Doubt, where his nail length becomes a hint to the audience. Well, Roger Moore's finger blades here are similarly distracting and send a negative signal to us in the audience. Not that there's going to be a plot twist about it, but rather just adding the risk of physical injury as one more reason for these women to keep their distance. Now, while the appeal of Moore's Bond is admittedly lost on us, we did for some time feel our position was validated by the female lead of the film, somehow named Holly Goodhead, played by Lois Chiles. She is clearly turned off by Bond's know-it-all smarm, his backhanded comments about her being beautiful, and she continues to deflect and reject him on every level and every turn. Even when she tactically accepts the seduction as part of her job of dealing with this guy, uh, her attitude and resistance earn our support and cheer, although we know the inevitable is coming. But when it finally comes, it's sudden and without much provocation. After fighting some bad guys, she just phase shifts into another swooning romantic connection, even cooing Bond's first name at him. Oh. Ugh. Of course, this was inevitable, but the complete transformation is just something that doesn't make any sense on a fresh viewing. Of course, we are to expect this. We are to understand this is the format for this kind of story. It is intentionally campy. The goofy tech gadgets in the speedboat slash hovercraft gondola are a dead giveaway for this, and we shouldn't take it that seriously. Right? But a plot needs to make sense. Characters need to behave in a way that is plausible for the audience to escape into the story, to relate to the characters, to feel anxiety and relief when they do, not question and reject it when they behave nonsensically. Now, let's turn to the plot of the film. The thing that critics actually found took them out of the story due to apparent lack of sense. The main issue was the idea that a single wealthy individual could fund and develop his own private spaceflight industry and become a major supplier of space vehicles to NASA and dedicate that company and his own resources to set up a colony in space. This just flatly went against common sense in 1979. Spaceflight was the province of governments. The United States and the Soviet Union had a space race to, well, get to space and land on Earth's moon, which for Galactizens is hilariously just named the moon by humans. They're so cute. Anyway, that was the very real world scenario that the audience was living in. Add to that the setting of the James Bond series specifically, which was the espionage tension between the US and the USSR, space and nuclear secrets going back and forth, with the UK enjoying a self-reverential relevance in this fictionalized set of stories. Nobody would buy that an individual person could just Bond villain their way into having their own personal space agency and also have Star Trek villain abilities to control audiences toward a vision. It was just preposterous. Well, until today. Everything weird and implausible about the plot of Moonraker is now the actual reality that humans live in. In Moonraker, the billionaire space magnate is Hugo Drax, played with absolute relish by Michael Lonsdale. Fleming and Lonsdale may very well have been using Spock's time stream reading tricorder from the City on the Edge of Forever, given how much it looks like they're flat out copying the future and only changing a detail here and there. First, there's the name, Hugo Drax, a name oddly enough composed of two four-letter words, with the second one sounding made up. Let that sink in. Oh. He's a middle-aged, brown-haired, vaguely European-sounding man with weird jackets who hangs out with young waifish models and socializes with government leaders. Check. His plan is to get humanity off the Earth and colonize space generally, with young people he has selected and swayed to his cause. Oh boy. Mind you, all of these eerie factors are new in the James Bond stories and set Drax apart from the other Bond villains. Instead, Drax has just one element in common with them, in that he's looking to kill lots of people as part of his plan. However, it was this previous set of stranger-than-fiction details that caused everyone to dismiss the story as not credible. Today, we can see these so-called implausible details are almost a documentary of the human billionaires today, with their own space programs, communication satellite networks, airline companies, entertainment companies, news companies, global retail and manufacturing monopolies, social media platforms, electric car networks, and so on. Most of what Bond uncovers and otherwise stumbles through in Moonraker, even in the actual Amazon, is now very much potentially real, and perhaps more plausible than most plain vanilla action movies released today, with their indestructible heroes and government conspiracies. By saying Moonraker's setting is implausible, the critics of 1979 are also criticizing the Earth of 2024 as being implausible. And yet, this is a common enough pattern in civilizations throughout the galaxy, where private enterprise jockeys for power with government organizations. This back and forth eventually moves those civilizations forward when they find the right balance between these forces. We've seen it all before. In fact, the most implausible thing about Moonraker is not the human targeting WMD that Drax develops. It's not the space station he builds in orbit. It's not the Space Force the US has on reserve just for these kinds of situations, all of which are exceedingly pedestrian things in the galaxy. Instead, the thing we'd pick out as implausible at this point would be how the somewhat Frankenstein-like henchman Jaws, played with tongue-in-cheek, planted firmly in the steel cheek by Richard Kiel, all of a sudden bursts out with this incredibly sexy voice for the single line he delivers. Oof, that really took us by surprise. Anyway, this is not to say that the film is not preposterous for all kinds of other reasons. For example, pretty much everything about space station life is wildly hilarious. Both the US Space Force and the Drax Security Force are firing lasers willy-nilly inside a space station. This one hits very close to home, if not directly at our home, since our work-life space is a space station. But even if it were not, any sentient being should know not to shoot guns in a space station. The first tiny perforation would crush the structure like tinfoil. Plus, you can infer that there would be automatic safety systems that would instantly freeze any such bad actor mid-button press. The fact that Drax anticipates an attack enough to install a ship-to-ship laser cannon, but doesn't have his facility hardened against laser fire, is enough to cancel his space villain club card. But we're going to let that go. We're going to let all the laser stuff go. All the times Drax could have easily killed Bond, all the times Drax just villain-splains everything, all the times a pigeon does a double take, all the times Bond casually says not to worry without any basis at all, we just accept these things. It's the Goldfinger rule. If it happened in Goldfinger, and we're still sitting here opting in to watch another James Bond movie, then we need to just accept that what we're looking at is the format of the entertainment. Like iambic pentameter, or James Bick Bondameter, if you will permit us some artistic license with humankind's favorite licensed killer. Anyway, returning to those 1979 movie critics who are down with that James Bick Bondameter, but not with the space billionaire context, we will quote an expanded universe character some of you may have encountered on Earth from another franchise, but has not been accepted into galactic canon for Earth content. We'll set that aside for a moment to actually say the quote because it's a good one and perfect for this moment. 1979 critics, every word of what you just said was wrong. And to Ian Fleming, posthumously, on behalf of all those long-gone critics, we offer you this reversal and apology for everything they said about Moonraker. Alas, that includes the praise, which was wrong. We're sorry to say that Roger Moore's Bond is not ageless and graceful, but the critique about the plausibility of the plot was also wrong. That space billionaire plot you came up with is Nostradamus level on the money, and a perfectly time-delayed satire of humankind right now. So, in the shockingly melty words of Jaws, who for us is the actual ageless charmer of the film, well, here's to us. Ha. And now a technical note. It is a pleasure to see this guilty pleasure classic 1970s science fiction film in sharp 4K detail on a large screen. The Kaleidoscape file size is 78.6 gigabytes, exceeding the size of most UHD discs, which generally max out at 66 gigabytes, unless you're James Cameron and can force a studio to use 100 gigabyte discs. At the same time, the film is presented in SDR, which we generally find perfectly fine, except that we particularly enjoy the wide color gamut that is along for the ride with the HDR spec. As a result, the film looks a bit more washed out than the vibrant look we have come to expect from current and remastered theatrical movies, and the HDR mastering for home video releases. Also, even with the larger file size on a relatively short 2-hour, 6-minute film, we did notice some compression artifacts, such as ringing and mosquito noise around characters as they move in some scenes. For example, as Bond walks through his firing mark against the busy forest background on Drax's estate. It is noticeable, and looks like a poorly implemented special effect, which is unfortunate since it otherwise appears to be a physical location and not a rear projection shot, undermining the hard work of the filmmakers. We hope that a file update will come soon, if the film is brought to 4K UHD disc. And so concludes this human version of our reflection on Moonraker. If you have feedback on it, please write in your own comments so that we can upload the galactic version to Zogplex. You can expect more discussions and reviews of theatrical movies, streaming shows, and 4K home video releases, and random things we decide to pop onto the channel as we continue to engage with your human rectangular content. So please watch, like, subscribe, and comment so that we can continue to have the human voice reflected in the cosmos. Until next time, farewell. Oops, I did it again. Farewell, humans.